Welcome to Resilience Rising, the podcast that shatters poverty myths, sparks optimism, and fuels innovative change through community-inspired discussions. The title of today's episode is Myth-Busting and Inclusion, Moving Towards Inclusive Communities. We're your hosts. I'm Amanda Fellows, Manager of Community Programs at CFS Counseling and Wellbeing.
And I'm Brian Shelley, the Chief Executive and Philanthropy Officer at United Way Simcoe Muskoka. Today we're talking to Sarah from the Gilbert Center, who works on the front lines, serving some of our community's most vulnerable folks. We'll be doing some myth busting as we discuss the harm reduction approach, specifically safe consumption sites, and what they actually mean for our communities. That and much more coming up on our show today.
On behalf of Brian and myself, I'm honored to acknowledge that we are currently recording on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. CFS Counseling and Wellbeing and United Way Simcoe Muskoka respect Indigenous history and culture and are dedicated to moving forward in the process of reconciliation with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. Thanks for being here, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Yeah, so Sarah, to start with, maybe explain to us where you work and what you do and who you support.
Okay. So my name is Sarah Tilley. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. I work for the Gilbert Center. We're an aid service organization here in Barrie, and we support Simcoe Muskoka. So my role is the Harm Reduction Program Manager for the center. I've had many roles in the organization, but I'm currently doing management, and as most of us in the social service sector know, that means frontline, supervision, and management.
Right.
And so some of what I do, I guess to start, I started out as a placement student with a vast history and a vast lived experience of my own. And I got involved with trans and non-binary healthcare research. That's actually what I started there supporting. And I eventually wound up in different roles while I was going to school that included working to support and engage sex workers in the community, doing harm reduction frontline, and building a harm reduction program within the organization. And now I'm the harm reduction manager.
Yeah, that's great. So the Gilbert Center didn't have a harm reduction program before you started there, and so you helped to build that from the ground up.
Yeah, so harm reduction has been interwoven through the Gilbert Center, I think, as long as it's been in existence. Harm reduction really has its roots within grassroots aid service movements. A lot of harm reduction actually started among queer and trans communities as a way to support people who were actively living and dying within the AIDS crisis. And so I think that as a whole, it has definitely been part of our legacy. But in terms of specifically creating and crafting programming for people who are using drugs specifically, that has been relatively new. When I started, the organization was in the process of writing the CTS application, which was not called the CTS application at the time. We were the lead applicants trying to get a supervised consumption site in Barrie with the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit in support. For a variety of reasons, we shifted gears and moved into programming, and CMHA took over that, but we have been supporting that and other initiatives for people who use drugs since I've been there.
So I just want to jump in because I think often when we use the term harm reduction, it's almost used synonymously with safe consumption sites, and safe consumption sites fall under the realm of harm reduction. But maybe explain for our listeners, what is the harm reduction approach?
Yeah, so harm reduction, while we often use it in connection to people who use drugs or drug use, harm reduction is really just looking at things that cause or could potentially cause harm and trying to find ways to mitigate that harm. So when it comes to drug use, that could be and often started out as ways to reduce the transmission of sexually transmitted and bloodborne infection. So HIV, hepatitis C, those sorts of things. And that's where needle exchange programs were born out of. That's where some of the safer supply programming, that sort of thing, that's where it stems from. But also the naloxone distribution programs, that also came out of the harm reduction movement. So that's specifically looking at if people are using drugs, how do we reverse an overdose, right? Like we've been using opioids for many years. And as they get stronger, we have found, like any other medication, found ways to mitigate some of the side effects.
So I'm a dad. I've got
Yeah.
a 7-year-old and 11-year-old. And one of them is at high risk of cavities, right? And so taking the harm reduction approach to that, if I'm following what you're saying, would be, it's not that I'm going to say like no more sugar. It's that, okay, we're going to limit the amount of sugar you have because we know that, there's too much sugar in your diet. So you can have one treat at lunch, and you can have a dessert with dinner. You can have juice at breakfast, but you're not going to have juice with lunch and dinner. We're going to make sure that we're brushing 2 or 3 times a day. We're going to make sure that we're flossing more regularly. So it's not about cutting out the sugar completely. It's about what are the interventions that I can put in, or supports I can put in as a parent, to help minimize that risk to dental decay.
That's a great example. And I mean, also, I think sometimes it's not even about limiting it at all. Like right now,
Right,
we think
sure.
of harm reduction or the only ways that we can support people who use drugs as limiting. But I mean, even if we look at an example such as driving vehicles, right? We know that driving vehicles can be dangerous. So there's all sorts of things that we put into place in order to reduce some of those harms. Seatbelts. So it's not that we're going to stop accidents. We hope to, but
Right.
it's not that we're going to stop accidents. We're going to put something in place so that if there is an accident, people are going to be less harmed. Driver's licenses, so that people who are allowed to operate a motor vehicle, they will have to get a license to demonstrate that they know the rules of the road, and creating rules on the road. All of those are forms of harm reduction.
Right.
We're not trying to get rid of driving. We know that so many deaths a year are a direct result of people driving vehicles, whether that's them themselves driving and getting in accidents, whether that's their passengers or people on the side of the road. We're not trying to stop that. We're trying to limit it, like limit the harms to everybody while continuing to engage in that behavior.
Right. I think that's an important distinction to make. And so thank you for that, and for walking that back a little bit and helping us to understand it. Because I think, there's these terms that are thrown around, and there's a lot of loaded opinions in the community, but it's without always understanding really what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think because harm reduction happens on a spectrum like you're describing, and most of the contention around harm reduction has to do with, substance use. That's where people get riled up about the concept of harm reduction, not so much about whether or not we wear a seatbelt or limit how much sugar we're taking on. Can you speak to kind of the health and well-being of people who are accessing harm reduction things or strategies, and why harm reduction actually supports folks and isn't necessarily always just such a contentious piece?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I'll step back a little bit there too. Part of harm reduction is some of the regulations we have around drug use. Like we often talk about drugs as being drugs that are considered illicit or illegal, or that are accessed through the black market. Almost all of the drugs that people are using in community come from a pharmaceutical lab somewhere. That's where they start. When people don't have access to that, they find ways of creating it or mimicking it. So almost all of the drugs of the people that I work with or have used myself, all of those drugs come from somewhere else, and they're often prescribed to people for a variety of different reasons. So I think before we can even consider like what I do in the work, I think it's really important to acknowledge that these drugs are being used throughout community for a variety of different reasons. And part of harm reduction for people who have access to medical care is that they have supports around how to use those drugs, what's considered safe, what they're allowed to be using drugs for, and depending on where you sit in society, what your social location or your positioning is, what kind of advantages and disadvantages you have, really limits the amount of access you have to things like healthcare, access you have to mental health supports, diagnosis. One of the things I don't think people realize is that methamphetamines, or crystal meth, for example, started out as an ADHD medication. And when people are denied ADHD medication because their behavior is viewed as criminal or is somehow problematic, oftentimes they're considered drug seeking if they're trying to get help for their mental health. And so our systems tell them they're not allowed to use that medication, and then they have to try and find it in other ways. And that unregulated supply causes so much harm. We're not seeing the same kind of harms with, when people are getting medication from a doctor. And so some of the things that we're doing to support people who use drugs through the harm reduction program is looking at what resources or access to supports and services are reduced because they're not able to get what other people in society are able to access.
And that may also look, I think if we talk about the term self-medication, right? So someone who uses alcohol, for example, to self-medicate or at the end of the day, if you're living in a middle-class household, you have the privilege of a safe place. Well, a bar is a safe consumption site, right?
Yes.
There's regulations and checks and balances in place there. You have also the privilege of being able to access an Uber to make sure you can get them safe. You can actually go into a store and you can buy safe supply of alcohol, right? Again, I think when we look at some of these terms and we start to flip them on on socially acceptable, quote-unquote, middle-class norms, we have all kinds of safe consumption and or harm reduction practices and tools in place. It's just that it happens to be for the socially acceptable drugs.
Yes, and socially acceptable forms of those drugs. Because those like opioids are acceptable, right? If you go into a hospital or if your pain is deemed an acceptable form of pain, you are allowed to access opioids legally, right?
Yeah, sorry, and what you just said there, someone said this the other day, and I'm not going to quote it because I'm going to get it wrong, but basically the genesis of the statement was we spend a lot of time focused on addiction and not enough time focused on the pain that's causing addiction, right? Why are people seeking to soothe themselves through drugs and or alcohol and or whatever it is?
Well, we see that a lot in the mental health context, right? So we have clients who come in who are looking to address the root cause of addiction, which is oftentimes trauma, always trauma, but, family systems issues, complex mental health needs. There's always other components attached to that, right? And I think the piece, when I listen to both of you talk about that, it really is socioeconomic status, I think, then sometimes that drives that stigma and discrimination, kind of even further, which I think is unfortunate. It's why we do this podcast. We talk about the intersections of poverty and all of those pieces. It's important. But the stigma and discrimination piece is huge. Can you speak to why, when we think about, can you talk about supervised consumption sites and what they are and, how things like that or other innovative practices help to decrease stigma and discrimination around people who use substances?
Yeah. I'm not sure that I would say that supervised consumption sites or CTS sites actually reduce stigma. In some spaces, we've seen it increase stigma. I think what it can reduce is the harms to individuals and harms to communities that is interconnected with extreme levels of poverty and drug use that can be seen in some of those communities, in some of those circumstances. In some spaces, so in BC, and this was many years ago, I don't know if they're still doing it, but they created communities that were intentionally constructed to include people from a variety of different socioeconomic statuses, different ethno identities, different people who are experiencing very different things in the same communities. Part of that was partially around the drug use that was happening in that time, but it was also actually a result of some of the stuff that was happening around the Robert Pickton case, if anyone is familiar with that, where a serial killer in the area was picking and targeting sex workers who used drugs because they were often considered less than human. And so when they went missing, the police didn't necessarily do anything about it, or because it wasn't really seen as something that was truthful. I don't want to say that I don't think the police cared about, whether or not there was a murder, but just that these people use drugs, they're liars, they disappear for long periods of time, so we don't need to pay attention. And that really allowed for a lot of harm. And so one of the things after that case happened, and to try and repair some of the damages in the community, was to create community tables, and not situation tables or collaborative tables among, we do that in social service sector where we try and connect with different organizations in order to better understand what we all do and connect and communicate and how we can help. But this was actually community members, BIA members, business members, politicians, that sort of thing, to connect and see people as human beings first, and then to work to create solutions for everybody. Because at the heart of it, people wanted safety. And what safety looked like to different groups of people was vastly different, as you can imagine. And I think one of the things that they probably worked through also was the difference between discomfort and safety. And so, but as a community, we want to support people to feel comfortable, and we want to support safety. So by bringing people together as community, they were able to reduce some of the harms that different groups of people in the community were doing to each other, kind of on a lateral perspective. Because they saw each other as humans first and then worked towards a collective problem.
Oh, that's cool.
I don't know if it's still happening, but
Right.
when I was in school, it was very intriguing.
Yeah. Well, I think this actually leads into my next question well, and it's, how can community members and allies actively contribute to creating safer and more inclusive spaces for marginalized folks who are impacted by poverty?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. That's such a huge
Go
answer.
on.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to that. First, I think we need to see each other as human. I think oftentimes right now, like, it's so easy. I was just having a conversation the other day with somebody about how engaging the internet is and how much amazing advancements that has provided us as a society, but how it disconnects us as human beings a lot of times, because we see a screen, we see an image on a screen, we don't see a person. And so I think first we need to, in order to be allies, we need to see each other as human beings so that we can become invested in the problems that people are experiencing. Oftentimes you think the answer is education, and the answer is partially education, but if we don't see someone's experience as valid or as something that we should care about, then it doesn't matter how much education we're going to get or how much education someone could provide us, because we're not really going to care about it. So once we have a community, or when we're building communities, we have to understand why some people in those communities are considered valuable and their choices are considered legitimate and some aren't. And so while we're talking today a lot about drug use and poverty, I think we need to take a step back again and say, why are people living in poverty? And we need to look at racism. We need to look at sexism. We need to look at homophobia and transphobia, and the kind of resources that some people are provided, and it's taken for granted as a society, and some of the resources that are just not given to certain people based on their identity. And we really need to understand how that impacts people, and then why they act in ways to support or survive in that kind of context.
So it goes back again, look at the root cause of the pain.
Yes.
As opposed to addiction, right?
Yes.
They get to the core.
And often community level pain. We're not just talking about an individual who's experienced abuse at home, which sure, that is a very valid thing, and that's something that happens all the time. But there are certain communities, there are certain groups of people that are often and continually and systemically left out of opportunities, whether that's people of color, whether that's Indigenous people, whether that is trans and non-binary folks, especially different groups of people in communities that are often considered or invisibilized. People are not even viewed as human or important. Their stories don't make the media. We're not talking about their hardships. And we need to look at why, and historically how we as a society have allowed it to happen, and we continue to perpetuate it without even realizing it. I think a lot of people, especially when it comes, so I also, as an AIDS service organization, I work in harm reduction, but we also support the queer and trans community. Some Two-Spirit community, we're really working hard to try and create space for Two-Spirit individuals as well within that realm. People who use drugs, as well as, sorry, it just escaped me, people who are living with HIV. Right? There are certain groups of people who have not been afforded a space to tell their stories. And before we can get into reducing the marginalization, we need to first bring those voices and bring those stories to life so we can see those communities as important.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to ask you if you could leave listeners with one message, what would that be? But I feel like what you just said is really powerful. I feel like that really puts a bow on it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'll add is, often if we go back to harm reduction and the concept of safe consumption sites, we talk about, we were talking before a little bit about how things are black and white. And often it's, we shouldn't focus on harm reduction, we should focus on rehabilitation, right? And those, they aren't mutually exclusive. But B, there's a lot of value or personal values in that statement, right? And it considers one way of living and one way of being as being, morally superior to the other. I think where we need to get to, and I think this is what you just said really, really, really beautifully, is at the end of the day, there's nothing more noble than saving a life. And every life is worth saving. And I think when we start framing our conversations around that, I think we can get to a much different place. And really, it all comes down to empathy.
I think so.
Well, and how do members of the community and allies help support that, right? Saving a life, being a part of that. How do people do that?
Yeah, thank you. I apologize. I rambled that away. So I think that, first we need to see people as human beings, and then allies and supports really do our own work. Challenge ourselves to better understand those pieces and also how to uplift those voices. So for myself, I can speak to my own work, I can speak to my own personal experience, but I can't necessarily speak to experiences of long-term incarceration, for example, as a result of drug use, those kinds of things. And so if I'm asked to speak on those topics, it's my duty to push back and use that space to elevate the voices of others. And I think that as allies and communities who want to support this work, we really need to focus on clearing the space and creating the space to rise up the voices of the people who are most impacted.
Sarah, thank you. So today we were joined by Sarah Tilley from the Gilbert Center. Sarah's professional contact information, not your contract, your contact information will be on our podcast pages alongside further resources. Thanks also to our studio partners at Uplift Black Center for Social Justice and Inclusion. We recorded today's podcast at their Up Beatbox Creative Studio in downtown Barrie. And of course, thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in. If you like this episode, please subscribe and use social media to let others know about Resilience Rising, the podcast that shatters poverty myths, sparks optimism, and fuels innovative change through community-inspired discussion. You can use the hashtag Resilience Rising.
And we'll see you next time on episode 4, which will be dropping soon, when we discuss seeking a better life, overcoming bumps and barriers on the Canadian dream journey. I'm Amanda Fellows of CFS Counseling and Wellbeing with my co-host,
Brian Shelley from United Way Simcoe Muskoka.
And we're asking you to embrace innovative change to ensure our communities are places to live for everyone. Thanks for tuning in.